Sodium balance is extremely important in the blood, and it's very carefully controlled by the kidneys. And this is done through the influence of angiotensin 2 as well as aldosterone. So, aldosterone, remember, the main thing that it does is it reabsorbs the sodium by the kidneys, and specifically 65% or thereabouts is reabsorbed in the first part of the renal tubule, in the PCT, the proximal convoluted tubule, and then 25% of it is reabsorbed, reclaimed in the nephron loop, specifically the ascending limb, as the nephron loop is returning back into the cortex. So, a couple things that happens when the aldosterone concentrations are very high. This is going to actively reabsorb in the distal convoluted tubule, as well as the collecting duct, the collecting tube, and then water follows the sodium. So that's an adaptation that occurs when it's high. When aldosterone's low, there's not going to be as much that's actively reabsorbed, and that sodium is going to be lost in the urine. So the influence of aldosterone and angiotensin 2 is shown on this slide. And one of the main triggers for the aldosterone then is the renin-angiotensin aldosterone system. So one of the triggers is the granular cells of the juxtaglomerular apparatus that secretes renin, and that does this in response to various stimuli, one of which is the nerve stimuli, the sympathetic nervous system stimulation, less salt that's in the filtrate, and also a decreased stretch of the granular cells because there's decreased blood pressure. So this is done to, of course, reabsorb more sodium to increase blood pressure. So the renin, it is responsible for the production of angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 is a vasoconstrictor, and that prompts the aldosterone to be released from the adrenal cortex, which is what we see on this diagram on our next slide here. So we can see here that one of the triggers is low sodium content, and that's going to trigger renin release, increasing angiotensin 2. Another trigger is high potassium concentration in the extracellular fluid, because the potassium should be low in the ECF, so this requires more sodium to be reabsorbed. So in both cases, it stimulates the adrenal cortex to release aldosterone, which we know works on the kidney tubules, thus increasing sodium reabsorption and potassium secretion. So we get rid of potassium, reversing the high potassium that was high in the extracellular fluid, returning us to homeostasis. So another hormone that plays a role with sodium specifically is atrial natriuretic peptide. And atrial natriuretic peptide is a hormone that lowers blood pressure. So we have several hormones that raise blood pressure, like aldosterone, angiotensin 2, ADH, but this one lowers blood pressure. And so we see on the left-hand side the role of the renin-angiotensin system. Then there's also the role of ADH, so it lowers ADH, lowers angiotensin 2, lowers aldosterone, all three of which would be responsible for raising blood pressure. But since it's being lowered, it ends up lowering blood pressure. So it's a classic negative feedback system. So the stimulus that causes atrial natriuretic peptide to be released is when there's an increased stretch of the atria due to an increased blood pressure. This hormone is directly released from the atrial cells. So a neural pathway that regulates sodium balance is on this slide, and it's the cardiovascular baroreceptors. So when the blood pressure is decreased, this will help to increase blood pressure and increase blood volume. So that's the neural stimulus. And all of these combined are shown on this next slide here. So if I zoom in on this kind of beige color right here, the stimulus that triggers all of these is a drop in blood pressure. So there's multiple mechanisms to increase blood pressure, one of which would be the neural response, which is what was on that last slide. So the neural response is that the baroreceptors sense the drop in blood pressure. Sympathetic nerves are going to be activated to cause constriction of systemic arterioles, and the end result is an increase in the peripheral resistance to increase blood pressure. There's also the classic renin-angiotensin system that we have seen now. So this is showing the decrease in the stretch of the afferent arterioles leading into the glomerulus. This is going to cause the granular cells of the kidney to release renin, and that leads to angiotensin II being formed. This is the enzyme. Renin works as an enzyme to convert a chemical called angiotensinogen to angiotensin I. But the real important chemical in this is angiotensin II, the vasoconstrictor. So the end result is aldosterone reabsorbs more sodium. Water follows that, thus increasing blood volume and increasing blood pressure. Because we know that blood volume and blood pressure are directly related. And then finally, on the far right, we have the ADH pathway, which we've seen. ADH is stored in the posterior pituitary. So when it's released, it causes the collecting ducts of the kidneys to reabsorb more water, thus increasing blood volume. So there's multiple ways that the body works to increase blood pressure with these multitude of different hormones. So our next slide shows us what happens with potassium. And when there's too much potassium in extracellular fluid, that is referred to as hyperkalemia. And a decrease causes hypokalemia. And if we remember what potassium does to the action potential, this should make sense. Too much potassium causes a decreased resting membrane potential. Too much potassium causes hyperpolarization and a much greater potential. So extracellular fluid potassium levels, when they rise, that's associated with acidosis, and a decrease is related to alkalosis, a higher pH. So the regulatory site for potassium is in the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct as well. And it's controlled here, and the influence of potassium is controlled by the certain cells here. So for example, low potassium levels cause the principal cells, a certain type of cells in the DCT, to reduce secretion of potassium, so to keep it within homeostatic levels. Aldosterone also inversely affects the example of, it inversely affects potassium, because when sodium is reabsorbed, potassium would be secreted. And also the parathyroid hormone has an effect here. So mainly the hormones are going to have an effect at the last part of the renal tubule. So parathyroid hormone, as we know, is our main hormone that controls calcium levels. But when calcium levels are low, the body first takes it out of the bone, and that happens by osteoclasts breaking down the matrix. to release the calcium and phosphate into the blood. It also then works on the kidney by increasing calcium reabsorption. And it also works on the GI tract to reabsorb more calcium into the blood.